Welcome to Module 2 of our Introduction to Management Accounting. In this video, we're going to talk about costs. Specifically, there's 5 terms I really want you to understand about costs. And then we're going to learn how to prepare something called the Schedule of Cost of Goods Manufactured, but you can't prepare a Schedule of Cost of Goods Manufactured unless you understand these 5 terms really well. So the 5 terms I want to go over are, first, direct materials, which I'll abbreviate as DM. Next, direct labor, which I'll abbreviate as I almost abbreviated as DM again, DL. And third, and finally, I abbreviated it first, MOH, which stands for manufacturing overhead. So those are the 3 core terms I want to discuss. Secondary to those terms, I also want to discuss selling costs and administrative costs. So when I was a student way back when, they actually didn't call management accounting class management accounting or managerial accounting. They call it cost accounting. And even still today, if you look at some of the textbooks in the subject, they're called cost accounting textbooks because cost is at the core of what we do in accounting. And in fact, like the first half of this course is all about costs. We'll learn about activity-based costing and job order costing, and there's process costing and several other types of costing methods, and it's fundamental at least to the first third, the first half of this class. But to understand any of that stuff, you really have to nail away this terminology. So the first cost term I want to define and want to explain a little bit is direct materials. And I think the easiest way to do this, the easiest way to understand this, is to define it in terms of, give a nice example. And the example I often give here is one that everybody can relate to. It's a chef in a kitchen, and the chef is making a hamburger. And so if we think about the direct materials of a hamburger, we have things like the meat goes directly into the burger. It's directly traceable to the burger. I know every burger has 200 grams of ground beef in the burger. Maybe the bun. I know every burger has a bun, and every bun costs me 50 cents. So let's say every burger has 100 grams of meat. Every 100 grams of meat costs me $1. Every burger has a bun, and every bun costs me 50 cents. So I can track my direct materials costs. Direct labor costs are the cost of the wages of the person who directly made the product. So in the case of the burger, it's the cost of the cook who cooked the burger, the cost of their wages. But it's not the cost of the wages when they're cleaning the grill. It's not the cost of their wages when they're going to the washroom. It's not the cost of their wages when they're doing any other side prep. It's the cost of their wages while they are cooking the burger. So direct labor is the cost of wages when the person has their hands on that specific item that they're preparing. So I'll call it direct wages. And so, let's say we pay our chef $10 an hour, and it takes them 15 minutes to make a burger. So we go, okay, it's $10 per hour. 15 minutes is 25% of an hour. An hour is 60 minutes. 15 minutes is a quarter of an hour. So, not 2.5, but 0.25. Means I pay $2.50 to my chef to make a burger. Now you might say, well, what if he's standing around for the 20 minutes before because there weren't any customers? He's just waiting. Well, that doesn't count as direct labor. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But direct labor costs the wages of the hands that made the product while they are making the product. Our third definition here is overhead. And for overhead, it's a much broader category. Overhead is all of the indirect costs of producing our product. So when I think of indirect costs here, I think of a few things. The first thing that pops into mind, just because we've been talking about it, is indirect labor. So the time the cook is standing there doing nothing, but I still got to pay them to be a cook because even if there's no customers, I need a cook there. That is indirect labor. Also, maybe a supervisor's salary, right? A supervisor doesn't actually cook the burger, but they're kind of the line supervisor, a shift supervisor. They don't have their hands on any individual burger. Maybe it's a fancy restaurant, they're an expediter. This is, again, an indirect labor cost. In order to have a kitchen, I have to pay utilities bill. I got to pay for gas to heat the stove. That is an indirect cost. So overhead is all of the indirect costs of the kitchen. So utilities would be an indirect cost of the kitchen. When we talk about this in other examples in the class, we'll talk about them in terms of indirect factory costs, but because my factory for making burgers is my kitchen, there'll be indirect kitchen costs. Other examples here, maybe I rent the building, and so I have a certain amount of square footage is tied up in the kitchen. Well, the kitchen has to field its share of the rent, so rent costs. If I don't rent then and I own, there's property taxes that would be applicable to my kitchen. Other types of indirect costs, indirect materials. We had indirect labor. Well, just the same, we have indirect materials, and that's the materials you need to run a kitchen that don't go directly into the food or aren't directly traceable to the food. So I put salt and pepper in my burger, but it's very difficult to know, did I put 3 cents worth of salt and pepper or 4 cents worth of salt and pepper of spices into that food? It might be difficult to trace. If I can trace it directly, I can say every burger has 5 cents of salt and pepper. Every burger has 5 grams of salt and 6 grams of pepper, or whatever the number might be. If I can directly trace it, I'd call it direct material. If I can't directly trace it, I call it indirect material. Undoubtedly, though, maybe the amount of ketchup would count as indirect, maybe direct. Undoubtedly, though, indirect materials for a kitchen would be cleaning supplies, right? They're materials, you need them to run a kitchen, but they're not directly involved in the food. We hope not. The cost of your dishwasher, your amortization on your assets, your amortization and depreciation of your dishwasher, your stove, your oven, all of these, depreciation costs are indirect factory costs. Now, I hope you're seeing something here. Direct material and direct labor, they're called direct for a reason. They're directly and easily traceable to the product. When I serve the burger to the person, I go, oh, look at that. There's $1.50 worth of food in front of them, plus $2.50 worth of wages. It cost me $4 to deliver their burger to them in direct costs. But there's all of these other indirect costs. There's indirect labor, utilities, rent, indirect materials, and amortization. How much went into that burger? That's the real $1,000,000 question of the first half of our class. The first half of Introduction to Management Accounting looks at many different ways of putting those indirect costs into our product and applying those costs to our product. And we're going to learn different ways of estimating this amount. We're going to learn job order costing, process costing, and activity-based costing in the next batches of videos. For now, though, I want you to have a solid definition of those 3 terms. Direct material, that's the cost of the meat in the bun if we're thinking about burgers. Direct labor, that's the cost of the wages of the hands that were working on cooking the burger while they were cooking the burger. Overhead, those are the indirect costs of running a kitchen or running a factory, whatever the case may be. So those are my 3 sort of costs. And we call these 3 costs, we say we add DM, DL, and MOH together, and we get product cost. That's the cost of the product. So the cost of the product, the cost of my burger here isn't $1.50 plus $2.50. It's not $4. I've also got to incorporate the overhead cost. How do I figure out how much overhead went into my burger? We'll find out in the future. But for now, know those definitions. Two more types of costs, and they're in their own category over there: selling and administrative costs. So we've got selling costs, and selling costs are the costs, like it sounds, to sell something. So they don't happen in the factory. They don't happen in the kitchen. If I were a restaurant, though, and I was selling burgers, if I have to put up flyers or marketing material, right, I'll call it advertising costs. If I have salespeople, or in the case of a burger, my servers are a selling cost. I can't sell food without server salaries. And again, when I think of this in context of a factory, I would think of this as I would think of salespeople. But in a restaurant, they're delivering the food. They're in charge of taking the orders. I would consider servers a selling type cost. The cost of keeping my restaurant side open. So like the cost of the property taxes or the rent on the restaurant side of the building. The utilities on the restaurant. My phone's buzzing like crazy. It's distracting me. Any of those costs of keeping the restaurant, the dining room where my customers go and eat, keeping that clean, all of those are selling costs to my business. So the last one is administrative costs. And when I think administrative costs, I think office costs. So any costs of kind of running the office, if there's accounting work to be done and I got to pay an accountant, that's an administrative cost. If I have legal bills, if I have, a receptionist that's not, maybe a restaurant's not the best example, but, if you're thinking of a big restaurant chain that would have a head office somewhere, absolutely, those are all administrative costs. The boss's salary and the CEO's salary. Bosses. Oh, I probably misspelled bosses, and I think I'm misspelling salary. There we go, boss's salary. So all of those are administrative costs. Now, these costs do not go into the cost of the product. We call selling and admin cost, and I won't say selling plus admin, but selling and admin are considered period costs. So at this point, I would trust that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 definitions in hand. Direct material, the cost of the meat and the bun in our burger, if we're a burger restaurant. Direct labor, the cost of the hourly wages of the hands that prepared the burger for the time they were preparing the burger. Overhead, the indirect costs of making a burger in terms of kitchen cost or factory cost when we talk about a more factory type business. Selling costs, the cost of selling whatever it is we sell, in this case burger, and so that'd be the cost of the servers and having a nice dining room. Those are the selling costs. Administrative costs are the office costs of the business. We call material, labor, and overhead. They combine to make product costs. Selling and administrative costs get classified as period costs. If you've understood those definitions well, you're ready to proceed with schedule of cost of goods manufactured. I'm also going to go over a couple of other cost terms in our next video before we jump to the schedule of cost of goods manufactured. But that's all for this video.